In August 1978, a career CIA analyst sat down to write an assessment of the situation in Iran. Protests had been spreading for months. The Shah's government had declared martial law. There were strikes, demonstrations, violence in the streets. The analyst reviewed the available intelligence, weighed it against what was known about the Shah's history of surviving political pressure, and concluded, in a document that would later become one of the most studied examples of institutional failure in the history of American intelligence, that Iran was not in a revolutionary or even pre-revolutionary situation. 5 months later, the Shah fled the country. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born. And the world that had been built on the assumption that the Shah was immovable began coming apart in ways that nobody who read that August assessment had prepared for. That analyst was not incompetent. That conclusion was not irrational. It was the product of a specific and very human cognitive pattern, one that has appeared with remarkable consistency in every major Iran crisis since. The pattern is not about intelligence failure specifically, or diplomatic failure, or market failure. It runs through all three simultaneously. It is the pattern of believing, until the last possible moment, that the situation you are watching is the same situation you have watched before, and that because it resolved before, it will resolve again. The name for it, in the language of psychology, is the availability heuristic. Now you judge the probability of something happening by how easily you can remember it happening. Analysts in 1978 could easily remember the Shah surviving political pressure in 1963, in 1967, in 1973. They could not easily imagine, because they had never seen, the Shah not surviving. The Shah had always been there, so he would continue to be there. The information that challenged that assumption, the reports from lower-level embassy staff, the warnings from Israel's representative in Tehran, the scale of the street demonstrations that dwarfed anything seen in previous episodes, was present in the system. It simply did not fit the frame. And when information does not fit the frame, human beings have a remarkable ability to make it disappear. This is not a story about Iran. This is a story about what happens inside human minds, and markets and governments, every single time an Iran crisis begins to unfold. Because the 1978 CIA assessment is not an anomaly. It is the template. It has been replicated in different forms by different institutions in every major Hormuz confrontation since. In 1984, when Iraq began escalating its attacks on Iranian oil tankers with newly acquired French super-étendard aircraft, the consensus among shipping analysts was that Iran would not respond in kind. The reasoning was coherent and evidence-based. Iran needed the Strait open to export its own oil. The Gulf was too important to Iranian revenues to be destabilized further, and Iran had shown restraint at sea for 3 years already. The consensus was not irrational. Iran had indeed shown restraint. And then, in May 1984, Iran began attacking tankers serving Kuwait and Saudi Arabia because the calculation had changed. Iraq had extended its range to Karg Island, Iran's economic lifeline. And the analysts who had built their model on 3 years of Iranian restraint discovered that the model was wrong, not because they had been careless, but because they had been watching the past when the present was already different. A family in Kuwait City did not know any of this in the summer of 1984. What they knew was that the war between Iran and Iraq had been going on for 4 years, and that it was somebody else's war. They had watched it on the news. They had noted with some anxiety that their country had been financially supporting Iraq. But the fighting was to the north and east, on land, in other people's fields and cities and oil terminals. When Kuwaiti tankers began appearing in the casualty lists, first one, then several, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. The price of food began to move. A neighbor who worked at the port mentioned that some shipping companies were getting difficult about routes. The war was still somebody else's, but it was getting closer. That feeling, the war is still somebody else's, it hasn't really started for us yet, is the psychological signature of every Iran-Hormuz crisis in its early phase. It persists far longer than the facts justify, because the facts are still ambiguous, because official voices are still saying the situation is manageable, and because the human capacity to absorb the possibility of genuine disruption to daily life is limited. We are built to function. Functioning requires assumptions of continuity. And so, even when the evidence is accumulating, even when the signals are multiplying, the brain keeps producing the same verdict. This is serious, but it will resolve. It always has. In 2008, Iran threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz if Western sanctions tightened. Oil moved 4 to 6%. Carrier groups sailed through. Iran backed down. The lesson the market took from 2008 was precise and deeply encoded. Iranian Hormuz threats are leverage, not intention. In 2012, the European Union announced a full oil embargo over Iran's nuclear program. Iran threatened again, this time explicitly, publicly, repeatedly. The same carrier groups appeared, the same standoff, the same Iranian retreat. The lesson reinforced itself. Iranian threats are the weapon. The actual closure is unthinkable. The pattern has held. Assume it will hold again. Though there is a name for this too in the intelligence literature. Robert Jervis, the political scientist commissioned by the CIA in 1979 to write their own post-mortem on the Iran intelligence failure, identified it clearly. He called it the problem of historical analogy. Analysts, he wrote, tend to interpret new situations through the lens of the most similar recent situations they can recall. When those previous situations resolved a certain way, the expectation of the same resolution becomes almost irresistible, even when critical features of the new situation are different. The Shah had survived before, so he would survive again. Iran had retreated from Hormuz threats before, so it would retreat again. The past becomes a cage for the present. In 2019, when the IRGC began seizing tankers, a British vessel, a South Korean vessel, others, the consensus was still operating inside that cage. The seizures were provocations, not preludes. Iran was demonstrating capability, not executing strategy. The situation was tense but containable. War risk insurance premiums tripled on some routes. Shipping companies quietly adjusted their route planning. A Norwegian tanker captain named Lars, who had been sailing the Gulf for 18 years, started plotting alternate passages through his charts that he had never used before. He didn't tell his company why. He just started doing it, quietly, because something in the accumulation of small incidents had crossed a threshold that his professional instinct recognized before his conscious reasoning caught up with it. Lars was ahead of the analysts. He usually was. The Pentagon, according to reporting from CNN in March 2026, it significantly underestimated Iran's willingness to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to the strikes that began Operation Epic Fury on February 28th. Not because the possibility had not been considered. Military planners had prepared Hormuz contingency plans for years. But because at a moment when global oil production was at record levels and the administration's energy advisors were confident in the abundance of supply, the tail risk, the worst case, the scenario where Iran actually followed through, was weighted less heavily than the historical base rate suggested it should be. The historical base rate said, Iran retreats. Iran needs the revenue. Iran will threaten and not act. The historical base rate was built from every previous episode, every episode where the cage held. Khamenei was dead within 24 hours of the first strike. The self-limiting logic that had underpinned every previous Iranian retreat, the revenue calculation, the long institutional memory of 1988, the supreme leader's cold assessment of where the line was gone with him. The cage that the historical base rate described had been constructed by a specific man, with a specific history, making specific calculations. By March the 2nd, the IRGC had formally declared the strait closed, not threatened, closed. The analyst sitting at the equivalent of that August 1978 desk, in the Pentagon, in Lloyd's, in the trading rooms of every major oil company, had once again been caught by the oldest trap in the pattern. They had judged the probability of the unprecedented by how easily they could remember it happening. The Kuwaiti family from 1984 knows how this ends. Not the specific ending. Nobody knows that yet, but the shape of it. The war that was somebody else's getting closer. The signals that were present before the crisis was acknowledged. The morning when the radio says something that makes ordinary planning, the school run, the grocery list, the savings account, feel suddenly contingent in a way it did not feel the night before. That morning always comes later than the facts warranted. And the distance between when the facts warranted it and when the morning comes, that distance is what the pattern costs. Every time. The CIA analyst in August of 1978 was not wrong because he lacked information. The Pentagon planners in February 2026 were not wrong because they lacked imagination. They were wrong in the same way, for the same reason, that everyone watching an Iran crisis has been wrong at the same point in the sequence. Because the crisis that is beginning does not look like a crisis yet. It looks like the previous one. The one that resolved, and the previous one resolved. So this one will too. It always has, until it doesn't. Like and subscribe to this channel and don't miss the next video. What people actually do when the crisis finally becomes undeniable. The panic purchases, the hoarding patterns, the spending that shifts first, the decisions that ordinary families make when the system stops behaving the way they planned for. History has documented all of it, and right now those patterns are beginning again.